in Federalist 70 argues that a unitary, fast-acting executive would be useful during emergencies such as wartime and would balance out and check the slow-moving Congress, preventing possible legal encroachment upon the executive. Hamilton adds that a unitary executive structure would ensure unconcealed accountability in government. Ultimately, Federalists prevailed, with Article 2 establishing a unitary executive.
One of the issues that was not truly resolved at the convention was the issue over slavery. Most of the states in the North at this point were fervently against institution of slavery, with most having already abolished institution within their own states. However, Southern states relied heavily on the slavery for their economies. This caused strife on whether or not these slaves could count as representation for the South in the House. The Northern states said no, but the Southern states disagreed. In the end, the 3/5 compromise was proposed by James Wilson in order to settle the issue, which would count each slave as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation, as seen in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Furthermore, the compromise Congress would be unable to tax exports or ban the importation of slavery until 1808. They also included a fugitive slave clause, forcing people to return slaves until the 13th Amendment. Until the 13th Amendment overturned this clause at the end of the Civil War. This didn't settle the dispute over slavery, however, and the animosity over slavery would last long up until the Civil War.
One notable addition to the Constitution that should be made is the explicit amendment of the right to privacy. This implicit right stemmed from the Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut, which nullified a Connecticut state law banning contraceptives. The case's majority opinion emphasized that the right to privacy was derived from penumbras formed by emanations of the First, Third, Fourth, and Ninth Amendments. This right was later reinforced by Roe v. Wade, which protects a woman's right to an abortion without excessive government interference. However, especially with the appointment of the conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett, with calls to repeal Roe v. Wade, access to safe abortions and as a result, the right to privacy are in jeopardy. Therefore, it is essential that an amendment be ratified that explicitly creates the right to privacy, not only to uphold cases like Griswold and Roe, but also to resolve growing concerns about increased government and corporate surveillance, such as PRISM and commercialization of personal data. Another significantly beneficial constitutional amendment would be the elimination of the Electoral College. Currently, the president is determined not by the popular vote of the general public, but by a number of electors apportioned by a state's total number of representatives. Because each state automatically gets 2 representatives in the forms of senators, this system unfairly skews the voting power of people in smaller states, leading to multiple elections where the Electoral College victor did not win the popular vote. Finally, the questionable actions of former presidents have shown that the pardon power of the president is too strong. Therefore, a constitutional amendment to provide a check against the executive power is imperative to prevent a corrupt system of pardons from forming.
All right, thank you very much. Sue or Beth, do you want to ask the first follow-up question?
Sure, I'll jump in. Madison argued at the convention and other places that the real division in the country pitted slave states against non-slave states. Was it a mistake for the delegates not to resolve the question and kick it down the road, or did they have no choice but to kick it down the road?
I feel like the biggest issue that they wanted to resolve then was to have the nation come together, especially after the Revolutionary War, right? So they didn't want to create any great schisms between the slave states and non-slave states, even though that already existed, because their number one priority was to have the nation come together under this constitution system. And they had to get the approval of all the states in order to facilitate that.
Well, at least 9 of the states. Yeah, but was that a mistake? In retrospect, was that a mistake?
Yes, I believe that it was a mistake in order to extend it further and not resolve it at the Constitutional Convention, because of the fact that the dispute over slavery then spread into the rest of the United States and where it expanded further. We had issues like the Missouri Compromise, where they had to have an equal balance of slave states, the Mason-Dixon line, and the expansion westward ultimately pushed this violence and chaos about the issue of slavery further west and prolonged it further. They should have resolved it at the convention to sort of consolidate the violence where it was in the first place, or the issue where it was in the first place.
I agree with my colleague Kai. I would also like to mention, just like he said, that kind of extending the issue of slavery until later on did cause a lot of violence down the road. For example, with Bleeding Kansas, and one could also argue that that the Civil War could have been not only prevented, but rather resolved in a different way. That is the issue of state rights as well as slavery. If we had not pushed down the issue of slavery.
We should move on. Go ahead, Beth.
Okay, thank you. So I thinking about what you had chosen in terms of what changes should be made, looking at the issue of privacy. Do you think the amendment process is the right way to do that, to address that issue? Is that the correct way? Is that what's going to make the most difference, is to do an amendment around the right to privacy?
I think generally that the right to privacy is not necessarily entirely at threat. However, I think the amendment process would enshrine it in a way that makes it more secure. Right now, there is technically the ability for the Supreme Court to overturn the right to privacy, or they relook at cases like Griswold, like Eisenstadt v. Baird, or cases like Roe v. Wade. Therefore, while it's not necessarily entirely likely that that goes away in the future, an amendment process could be the right way simply because it cements it and allows it to be more permanent and harder to change for the future.
I would like to agree with my colleague Kai in this kind of, and in that Federalist 78 kind of shows that the judiciary is the weakest branch, and therefore Supreme Court cases protecting the right to privacy, such as Roe v. Wade, are at risk, and therefore more legislation that would explicitly protect this right would be very useful in indeed protecting the right to privacy, simply because the legislative does have the ability to override court cases in the form of new legislation.
So you would go for legislation and not the amendment process?
That is a good question. I think that either would be a good option, to be honest with you.
John, jump
Okay.
in.
Yeah,
All right.
go ahead. Thank you.
I want to go back to the idea that you threw out on the elimination of the Electoral College. Coming from me personally, a state with a relatively small population, and that you are in a state with a relatively small population, how do you, if you were to eliminate the Electoral College, how would you ensure that voters like us would ever see a presidential candidate from any other vantage point than from the looking up at an airplane as they fly over us?
Well, I think one issue that I think is that while the Electoral College does allow for some representation of smaller states, I don't think it entirely skews the way that most people would like it to do so. I mean, the urban areas within those states still have a vast, majority of the leeway in which way that states votes, simply because of the size that they have. And so I think the intent of the Electoral College is sort of to make sure that rural votes are more heard. But I think in many ways that practice isn't actually being fulfilled because of the facts. Like, for example, Nebraska has two cities, Omaha and Lincoln, that make up over 50% of the population. And so I think even though the intent of the Electoral College is there to sort of ensure those rural interests, it doesn't always keep that true. So a popular system would make it just more equal for what it's actually doing.
If you live in a big city.
Yes, yes.
Would you also amend the Constitution to get rid of the Senate the way it is currently constituted? Because therein lies the real bias in favor of rural America.
I mean, I think there are definitely there's definitely a bias inherent, right, in the Senate, right, a bias towards rural America. However, I think like what McKellen talked about earlier with the compromise system that came up with at the convention, it's important to sort of keep that there as the balance between rural and urban areas. The House sort of acts as the urban balance, and then the rural balance is the Senate.
But when you go back to the convention, what you see is the same compromise that's behind the legislature is behind the Electoral College. Why is it okay for the legislature but not okay for the executive?
I think because it's sort of like having multiple compromises consolidating into one, right? There's one equal compromise in areas like the legislative, where you have the House versus the Senate, right? Those two are opposed to each other. However, with the Electoral College, that compromise isn't necessarily negated by some other advantage for a different group. So I think it's sort of the compromise idea is that both sides get what they want. And so I think the Electoral College is for the presidential level doesn't necessarily do that because there is no sort of opposing side, I guess.
And one thing that I kind of want to add on to that is that like the executive and the legislative branch kind of serve different roles. And I feel like when the executive branch, as the top of the executive branch, is the president himself, and he kind of has like represent the interests of the entirety of America, and one, I guess, individual cannot really do that, but we have to like elect the person who like best represents the common good per se, right? But when we talk about the legislative branch, we talk about in each of these states having their own interests and them all like trying to have their voice be heard individually within like the chambers of like our legislative branch, right? So we have to taking into account that like we want to have that sort of balance in the legislative branch while having like the representation within the executive branch as well.
Move on.
Do we have enough time?
Yes.
Okay. So you talked to me about the why of the pardoning power, but how would you check pardoning power?
I think one possible way to go about it is similar to the way in which impeachment can function, whereas a pardon could therefore be overturned. It's not obviously a perfect solution, right? There still needs to be the partisan issues can still prevent that from actually going through, and it still makes the pardon power is still very powerful in that instance. But having any check whatsoever helps to sort of counter any corrupt influence that might happen with a pardon.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice time.
Thank you so much. Let's give Nebraska a round of applause. Thank you. Unfortunately, to keep everyone on time, we're going to have to skip feedback. Judges, I'm opening.
Thank
up
you,
the
gentlemen.
breakout room.
Hey,
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
gentlemen.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank
job.
you for the
Have a
conversation.
wonderful day.
Good.
Thank you.